Laura Burton is here talking with Grandma about her stories from the past. I am currently at Santa Clara. I just finished my freshman year and I'm playing water polo here. And we are up at the cabin this summer, spending time in the great sun out in the lake, and can't wait to go boating on the 4th of July and spend some time at Dave's. So let's hear what Grandma has to say today.
Good, thank you, Laura. This is really fun to be here. I had a previous conversation with Matthew, and I talked about the year that we spent going around the world. But I think I'm going to start at the beginning of the story of my life. I was born in 1928, actually in Fargo, North Dakota, in a hospital. But I lived in Moorhead, Minnesota all the time. My mother was 21 and a half. My father was 22 and a half. But I was born in the hospital, I said. The oldest of 4 daughters, and I was the only one born in the hospital. The other 3 sisters were all born at home, with my grandma being the midwife. So it was really special to be in the hospital. I had Joanne, Lois, and Sylvia as my sisters, and Joanne and I were always the big kids, and Lois and Sylvia were always the little kids. And Sylvia was always sure that she was going to be a little kid all her life. We lived probably about a year in an apartment, and we were very poor. So we moved into the house with my grandma and grandpa, Lyseth. He was Arndt Anton Lyseth, and my grandma was Magdalene Sherritt Lyseth. But we called them Nanny and Dan, so that was always it, Nanny and Dan. And the address was 709 First Street South, Moorhead, Minnesota. The house had a porch across the front and then along the side. There was a living room and a dining room and a kitchen, and then there were 3 bedrooms upstairs. So when we moved in there, my mother and daddy and I, and then later on Joanne, we moved into the kitchen. They turned the kitchen into a bedroom for us. And then they moved the kitchen downstairs into the basement, had a great big table and a stove. They didn't have refrigerators then, they had ice boxes. And there was a toilet down there, and there was a sink and a shower. I think at one time there were probably 17 or 18 people of us living in that house. In the one house.
With the 3 bedrooms?
With the 3 bedrooms. I just can't believe it. There was a porch across the front, but it wasn't heated at all. But there was Nanny and Dan, and then there was my mother and father, and then Joanne and I, and there was Aunt Ostrid, we called her Osti, and she had 2 children, Marilyn and Chucky. And there was Grandma Anna, and there was Grandpa Nikolai, and there was Tanta Emma, and then there were my dad's 2 brothers, Ray and Vic. So it was really a crowded house.
Sounds like it.
And there were bums that came around all the time. We called them bums. They could have been tramps, they could have been vagrant people, but they were coming around. I mean, this was the Depression, and it was really poor times. And so my grandma, Nanny, always would feed them out in the backyard. So it seemed like we'd go outside out of the house, and there would be a bunch of bums, as we called them, eating whatever she had to feed to them. Well, then another year or so, we moved across the street. Everyone actually got along just great. It was just a real fun, nice time all the time. As I said, we were very poor. My mother and I would either take a wagon or a sled, and we'd go to the railroad station, and then the trains would come in, and they'd have all this surplus food. So you might get oranges, or you might get flour or dried eggs or anything like that. My dad he was just too proud. There was just no way he could go down there and get the surplus food. I don't know if it was free or what. But anyway, my mother and I always did that. So then, Pearl so I went to first grade through ninth grade in Moorhead. And then Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941. My dad was looking for work and wanted to do something, so he and his brother went out to Spokane and then to Seattle and then to Portland looking for work. And it was defense work then after Pearl Harbor. And so my mother and we four girls were alone in Moorhead for the year. She worked at the creamery, and I took care of the three younger kids. But then my father found a job in Portland in a shipyard. And so my mother and we four girls packed up and everything we had and got on the train and took the train from Moorhead out to Portland. It was absolutely packed with servicemen, you know. So I was 14 and 15, and Joanne was 13, 14, and so these soldiers were around us all the time, talking to us, and you know, all the time. Well, we finally got out to Portland, and in Portland there were like 3 or 4 shipyards. One of them made, I can't remember the names of, well, one of them probably made aircraft carriers, another kind of a ship, and Swan Island made tankers. So my father worked out there, my mother worked out there. He was a carpenter, and she was a welder. She wasn't Rosie the Riveter, like, you know, was the big thing of the women in the Second World War, but she was a welder. And we lived in Vanport. It was a town that had been built up only for the defense workers. And so there were maybe 100,000 people living there, and it was just an absolutely terrible place to live, absolutely terrible. One big ghetto, kind of just unbelievable, but I'll tell you about that some other time, all the specifics about Vanport. But there were great big buses that came around every morning. We called them cattle cars. And they came around and they picked up all the workers. So they picked up the workers for one shipyard, and then they'd take them and deliver them, and then they'd come back and take for the next. And then the third route was usually the high school kids then that had to go to school in Portland. So we would get on the bus, and then we'd be delivered to a high school. I went to Jefferson High School. And so all of the Portland kids would say, oh, here come the Vanport kids, here come the Vanport kids. And they really just looked down on all of the Vanport kids that were living in this big slum area, really. It really didn't bother me that much. I was real smart, and I did real well in school, and I had had a marvelous first year of Latin in Moorhead, so I really knew Latin very, very well. So I'd go into Latin class, second year Latin, and then all of the kids would come around me and say, what's the answer? What's the answer to this? What's the answer? So I just felt absolutely perfectly fine. I had 2 years living in Vanport. Then my folks bought a house, and they bought it just a couple of blocks from the school where I was going to Jefferson High School. And so I graduated from high school in 1946 out there in Portland. And actually, I think it was in 1948 that Vanport was just swept away in a flood. There was a highway, interstate, and then there was the railroads on one side. That was pretty high, and then there was a dike on the other side. And the rains and everything just came in, and the Columbia River just flooded and just kind of washed away the whole town. And they said no one died there, but my mother was always sure that, you know, must have been at least, you know, 50 people or more. It was a Sunday afternoon, and so they had been saying Sunday morning, don't worry about the floods. The dikes are going to hold. It's just going to be absolutely fine. And the flood just came and just swept it all away. You drive by there now on interstate. It's close to Jansen Beach and on the way to Vancouver. And it's just a great big kind of real almost swampy area. Nothing is built there at all. So it was not a good place to live. So then I graduated from high school, and I thought, I'm going to go to St. Olaf. I didn't know anything about St. Olaf. I had hardly heard about it, but I knew it was a Lutheran school, and I thought, I think I'd like to go to a Lutheran college for 1 year, and then I'll go to the University of Oregon. And so I went, and didn't know one single person there, didn't know anything about the college, but then I met Jim there, and that's kind of the next story.
The rest was history.
The next is history. Yeah, but that can be for the next time.
Great. Well, it was great to hear about growing up.
Well,
It's great
thank
to
you.
hear all of that.
Well, sometimes it's, you just don't kind of think about what it was like 70 years ago or
Yeah.
whatever it was, 80 years ago. Well, thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Grandma.